In 1917, the House of Windsor came into being by the proclamation of King George V. Replacing the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the Windsors have sought to run the nation of Great Britain with a headstrong, dutiful approach. Whereas many would shy from the task, it is a royal's responsibility to promise and strive for the longevity of their people, to lead the nation through thick and thin, whether on the lines of war or in the houses of the Commonwealth. For the people, they work to survive. And by the people, their voices are always heard.
My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
For royal families, as for the rest of us, life has its times of sorrow as well as joy. With this royal family, the British peoples have shared both. To the King, who in his own words now enters upon a new life, and to his charming Queen, Britain and Empire wish many years of happiness. Long may they reign. God save the King.
The year is 1936. A cold January night. A solemn feeling surrounds the grounds of Sandringham House, as George V lies on his deathbed, surrounded by his physicians. His sons, Edward, Albert, Henry and George, and daughter Mary, await the news of his passing. Though a stern, expressionless man, King George V had led the country through the turmoil of World War I, being the King of British dominions and Emperor of India. He faced conflict with a determined mindset. Such a dutiful and hardened demeanour would carry down to George's second son, Prince Albert.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing and gregarious. He had no particular interest in fashion, no particular interest in chasing after women, although his brother encouraged him in doing so, and he was in fact involved in various affairs and so on, which have been not as much talked about as you would expect. But as a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
George VI was quiet as a child. He had a good relationship with his other siblings, but he wasn't as excitable as his older brother Edward, or as outgoing as his youngest brother, who would later be known as the Duke of Kent. Edward and his youngest brother, the Duke of Kent, they lived very fast lives, they partied hard. Albert was a more withdrawn figure, closer to his father than his other brothers, and in keeping with his father's interests, shared many of those interests, things like shooting. He enjoyed the quiet life away in the countryside, out of the public eye.
A reserved man by nature, Albert sought to live a quiet life. Marrying Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, his desires strayed from public confrontation. Though both Edward and Bertie contributed to the military, Edward was far less dedicated to his father, King George V's values.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years, very, very much in love. It was a very conventional match. I mean, unlike Edward and his various mistresses and Ben Wallace, there was no question that they would get married. They got married and had two daughters. And essentially it gave him a stability and a happiness that he'd always wanted. She was a more dominant figure than he was, just as Wallace was a more dominant figure than Edward was. But she was also somebody who loved him and was keen that he be kept away from the more taxing aspects of royal life, because she knew how, I suppose these days we call it anxiety that he suffered from, which led to the stammer, and she knew that he had this, and she thought the best way of dealing with it was to deal essentially by removing him from situations he wasn't comfortable in.
Upon the outbreak of World War I, Edward was keen to serve on the front lines. However, due to his royal lineage and being the first in line for the throne, he was kept away from immediate danger. Instead, serving in the Grenadier Guards and undertaking several foreign tours. Though a respectable choice as the future king, he would soon become engulfed with popularity and fame, becoming the most photographed celebrity of the time period. With such fame, Edward manifested an unconventional attitude towards kingship, opting for a lavish, flamboyant lifestyle, more in line with his Tudor predecessors, than a dutiful demeanour, that which was portrayed by both his father and mother.
As a king, Edward took his role quite seriously, certainly when it came to being out and about in amongst his subjects. When he'd been Prince of Wales, Edward was very active, going out into villages, towns, cities, meeting, greeting ordinary working class people. There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special, intimate relationship with them. This continued when he was king. However, in terms of the business of government, he was less dutiful. He wasn't as exacting as his father. He wasn't as committed to going through government papers, to signing those off. Often, courtiers would come home and find government documents covered in sort of stains from wine glasses and that sort of thing. He didn't take that work as seriously as he should have done.
Before being crowned for kingship, it was clear that Prince Edward's heart was not set out for leadership, instead opting for romance with his newfound partner, Wallis Simpson. Opting for a morganatic marriage, Edward would abdicate the throne, and Bertie, his shy, introverted younger brother, would take his place as king in 1936. In 1926, Elizabeth was born. Being first in line to the throne, she would be raised in the ideologies of her father, Bertie. Unlike Edward's rejection of his father's word, the young Elizabeth was keen to adopt her duties. Bertie understood the difficulties of living under the expectations of a cold, brooding father. Knowing this, he treated Elizabeth and soon Margaret with compassion and adoration, finding a balance between his royal duties and family values. He was said to have called Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy. The new king of the United Kingdom asked his eldest daughter Elizabeth to write an account of his coronation so that she would one day feel more prepared for her own. Elizabeth did as she was told, and she would write about her father in a very loving tone, addressing him as her papa, and that he looked very beautiful on that day.
To Mussolini, when he first became dictator in 1923, all things seemed possible.
The world was divided. The three camps of democracy, fascism, and the Soviet Union brought forth a conflict like no other. The ideologies concerning territory and economical wealth led to world leaders at each other's throats. It was in 1922 that Benito Mussolini would take power in Italy, turning the country into a fascist, dictator-led state.
George, unlike Edward, was actually allowed to serve in World War I, and he did so with some distinction. And he was seen as somebody who was able to both be quite brave under fire, but also somebody who would actually do the job. And I think that what was important for him, as it was important for his brother, was mixing with the people who would later become his subjects, because it gave him a real insight into what it's actually like to be a young man in 1914, 1915 Britain. And he saw appalling things up close. I mean, he saw death, he saw horrendous maimings and so on. And that's the kind of thing that really affected him. And I think that was psychologically hugely important for him, that he'd actually had a real sense of what war was like. So when the Second World War came about, he was much better equipped to be a wartime king than his brother would have been.
In the early 1930s, the uprising of fascist governments took hold of Spain, Portugal, Austria, and Romania. However, it was in Germany where fascism was taken to the greatest extremes.
In jeder Stunde, an jedem Tag, nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere deutsche Nation. Unser deutsches Volk Sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
In late August 1939, Hitler and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggressive Pact, which raised concern in London and Paris.
The lights began to burn all night in Moscow. British and French military missions arrived to confer with the Soviet government. So did German representatives. And on August 21st, 1939, the world was set on its heels by the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other.
Upon his newfound dictatorship, the German troops would be positioned in Rhineland, a German industrial area located next to the border of France and Belgium. During such time, the first concentration camps were introduced in German-occupied Poland, a nation of which Great Britain and France had guaranteed military support if it were attacked. Bertie, now known as George VI, would be in an uncomfortable position, having been appointed as king against his desires. It was up to him and his family to prepare for the imminent conflict. With a terrible speech impediment, George and his wife Mary Elizabeth Lyons sought help in Lionel Logue to prepare him for public speech. Though previously known as a symbol of peace in Greece and India, Adolf Hitler would adopt the swastika in 1935, symbolizing the rise of the Nazi Party. In 1938, Hitler's troops converged on Austria, taking the territory alongside parts of Czechoslovakia. He declared a union between the two countries, inevitably breaking the Treaty of Versailles, which was established at the end of the First World War. In the meantime, Italy had expanded its power in the Mediterranean and North Africa, and Japan had invaded China. The ties between Germany, Italy, and Japan were growing stronger with the newfound territory. The British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, tries to appease the incoming war, soon seen as a policy for weakness.
The 1938 Munich Agreement comes out of the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference was arranged with the help of Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, and involved Neville Chamberlain as Britain's Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, France's Prime Minister, and of course Adolf Hitler. This is because Adolf Hitler wanted to take over part of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, and Neville Chamberlain wanted to oversee some kind of peaceful handover of power and territory where the Czechs would give up this territory to Hitler, and as a result of that it wouldn't end in world war on the continent. There were real fears in the summer of 1938 that Britain was headed towards a war with Germany, and Chamberlain was trying to do everything he could to avert it.
His bargaining had failed and was soon to resign from the position after losing a confidence vote in the House of Commons. The mood in Britain was foreboding of the emerging conflict. It was inevitable, undeniable, and the people all knew. Dark days would soon be upon them. World War II had begun.
Denkt heute kein Mensch an einen faulen Kompromiss. Das ganze Volk denkt nur an einen harten Krieg. Die Gefahr, vor der wir stehen, ist riesengroß.
King George VI had established a close personal relationship with a potential candidate for the next Prime Minister, Lord Halifax, even granting him the keys to the gardens of Buckingham Palace. Though Halifax was in the recommendation, he was heavily overshadowed by the charismatic and iron-fisted Winston Churchill. Against King George VI's desires, Halifax pulled out of the running for Prime Minister, pleading ill health, and it was decided Churchill would take the role.
It's entirely true that George wanted Halifax to become Prime Minister after Chamberlain had to resign, because he felt that Halifax was a more experienced older man, they'd worked well together, he felt that Halifax was the right kind of person, and also Halifax's instinctive sympathy for appeasement meant that both men felt that there was something that they could agree on philosophically. Churchill was not seen as somebody who was amenable, he was seen as somebody who was entirely his own person and would not listen to advice, would not do anything that the king didn't want him to or that anybody else didn't want him to. And so there was a great fear. It was the idea of, do you appoint the company man, who would essentially be the continuity chamberlain, or do you appoint somebody who could be brilliant or could be a disaster? So Churchill becoming Prime Minister was something that George VI was very, very opposed to, but nonetheless he didn't see another way around it.
If we wish to abridge the slaughter and ruin which this war is spreading to so many lands, and to which we must ourselves contribute so grievous a measure of suffering and sacrifice, we cannot afford to relax a single fibre of our being or to tolerate the slightest abatement of our effort. The enemy is still proud and powerful. He is hard to get at. He still possesses enormous armies, vast resources, and invaluable strategic territories. War is full of mysteries and surprises. A false step, a wrong direction of strategic effort, discord or lassitude among the Allies might soon give the common enemy the power to confront us with new and hideous facts.
1920, Hitler began. He was considered just a joke then, a raving crackpot. 1933, Hitler made Chancellor. The world hoped he would bring order. He brought catastrophe. The Hitler gang planned world conquest. Rudolf Hess, now insane in England, Heinrich Himmler, mass murderer, and Goering. Hitler promised Germany the world. Germany listened, but the world ignored the threat. Hitler poses as humanitarian, but Hitler even then was planning war and the death of countless children.
George, less close to Churchill, sought the means to bury his doubts and communicate with the new Prime Minister. Together, they formed a companionship. The shy king and the outspoken minister.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
The day that war was declared against Germany was a great moment of sadness and concern for the British public. They understood why this point had been reached, that Hitler had time and again broken promises, and as a result, Chamberlain and Chamberlain's government had been forced to declare war on Germany. In this moment of crisis, the British public, I think, were looking for leadership not just from the government, but also from the British royal family. They were looking for reassurance that everything would be okay and that the nation would get through this moment of peril.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
Hitler, after a little less than a month, would seize dominion over Paris and a large sum of French territory. Germany and the Soviet Union had divided control over the nation. It was here that the sounds of sirens would echo over Great Britain. The growing certainty that German bombers would make their way to the British skies meant that a mass evacuation of children to the sanctuary of the countryside was no longer just a possibility. Elizabeth and her sister Margaret were also evacuated. Though North America or Canada were available for Elysium, the two were instead sent to Windsor Castle, away from sight, from the Axis, and their own parents.
In 1940, Hitler began to bomb England. Thousands of children were evacuated, among them Elizabeth and Margaret, now 14 and 10, who were sent up the Thames to a safer haven.
Queen Elizabeth was the first to hear the whir of a German plane, and as she described, the scream of a bomb.
The 500 German planes that came over that day, more than 1/3 were shot down.
In the 28 days of terror from September 7th to October 5th, the Nazis dropped 50 million pounds of bombs on the city, killed 7,000 helpless civilians, and wounded 10,000 more. Bombs fell on Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, Fleet Street, the center of the news, St. Paul's Cathedral.
Buckingham Palace was bombed with 5 high explosives, devastating the royal chapel's inner quadrangle, the palace gates, and the Victoria Memorial. As the King and Queen were partaking in their morning tea, the explosion sent them into a frenzy. It would later be known to have injured 4 of the palace staff, with one dying from their wounds.
But by a surging spirit of courage the like of which the world has never known. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them. And they know, too, and are comforted by the thought that England is not taking its beating lying down. They are guarding the frontiers of freedom. It is hard to see 5 centuries of labor destroyed in 5 seconds. But London is fighting back. I am a neutral reporter. I have watched the people of London live and die ever since death in its most ghastly garb began to come here as a nightly visitor 5 weeks ago.
Buckingham Palace was bombed on several occasions in World War II. The most spectacular one came relatively early in the war, when bombs landed sufficiently close to George VI and to Queen Elizabeth and to their Private Secretary Alec Harding that if it hadn't been for a couple of minor bits of chance, they almost certainly would have been killed. And it's very interesting to see this because whoever bombed Buckingham Palace knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly which parts of the palace the King and Queen would have been in. They knew exactly where to hit it. So there was clearly somebody working off some kind of intelligence which was not intelligence the general public would have had, and it's certainly not intelligence that Nazi Germany would have had. The question we have to ask is, how would you have got that intelligence were it not for the fact there was somebody who was at loose who would have been able to tell people exactly, if you wanted to bomb Buckingham Palace and kill my family, this is how you do it. And of course the question is, did Edward actually want to see George VI and the Queen killed? I don't know is the answer to that, because on the one hand, he didn't like his brother, he was angry with his brother, but was he actually a traitor? I don't know. But what I think you can say is that his acts, even if they were not committed with intentional treachery, certainly added up to treachery. The King and Queen were exceptionally nearly killed, and it was just a stroke of luck that they weren't. I mean, at one point, windows had been left open that probably wouldn't have been left open under normal circumstances. If the windows had been shut, they would have smashed into 1,000 pieces of glass, probably would have killed everyone in the room. After the palace was bombed, they were both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very, very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, "I look outside, and I can't forget seeing the bomb." And it's quite clear that it had a kind of traumatic effect on both of them.
The King and Queen, though shaken, would use this as an opportunity to stand with the Commonwealth. Such public appearances would go on to increase their reputation with the British people. The royal family, being a significant target to the Axis, would be recommended by the Foreign Office to flee the country. In response, the Queen exclaimed, "The children will not leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does. And the King will not leave the country in any circumstances whatever."
What was very interesting was that, especially after Buckingham Palace was bombed, and the King and Queen went out into the East End to see that they'd been bombed, and the Queen famously declared, "I'm glad we've been bombed because it makes me think I can look the East End in the face." There was a real sense of the traditional bounds coming down, a real sense that they were all in it together.
The King and Queen were very keen to emphasise a narrative that they, the royals, and the British public at large were all in this war together. There was a sense of shared sacrifice that united crown and people.
What you saw with the King and Queen was that they really were cheek by jowl with their subjects. I mean, they knew they could have been killed just as anyone else could have been. And although, of course, they did all these things with an eye for publicity, it was also something that they genuinely believed. They genuinely were sincere about the idea of wanting to be standing alongside their subjects who had been bombed, who were going through the same things they were, because obviously they knew they were just as likely, if not more likely, to be bombed than anybody else.
Once again, Londoners who have known nights of terror before return to their bombed-out homes. Britain's beloved monarchs are on the scene a short while after, again demonstrating a human sympathy for their subjects, whose courage has never yet been shaken. But king, queen, or humble citizen, all veterans of the Blitz, demonstrate once more that London can still take it.
What George VI realised in World War II was that it was a conflict like Britain had never known before. It was a conflict which was going to be fought not just in terms of battlefields and across the world, but it's also going to be fought via the media. It was going to be fought in recorded speech, it was going to be fought in newsreels. It's very important that you had to look the right way, because every time that he was being filmed was something that was being distributed around the world. And a lot of Britain's allies, or putative allies, such as America, were looking at Britain, especially after the fall of France in 1940. The questions that they were asking are, do we let Britain stand alone? Do we let Britain fight on their own? Or do we actually try and help them? Is this worth our getting involved in? So George was aware that in addition to being his country's king, he was also acting as a kind of global ambassador. He was able to say, I have to be the king that Britain needs, both in a symbolic way. I have to be the person who can be in the newsreels, who people can feel inspired by, but also in a practical way. I mean, he was somebody who he understood the minutiae of involvement. He was able to participate in this thing, which only came out quite recently, this sort of MI5 double-cross operation, whereby he was being filmed for newsreels, these non-existent plants, all of which were designed for the Germans to believe that D-Day would be happening somewhere different. And he enjoyed all that. He enjoyed the subterfuge, he enjoyed the sense that he was doing something worthwhile.
Like his own father, King George VI would recognise the nature of modern warfare. As such, he would visit a large number of locations outside of Britain to provide a boost to the much-needed war effort. the king would proceed to institute the George Cross and the George Medal, providing such accolades for acts of bravery by his citizens. Such work would undoubtedly forge a sense of unity throughout Britain.
But he also enjoyed the sense that he was actually making a difference, because he was a king who was getting involved in a way that very few of his predecessors ever had. He was actually being asked by military leaders both from Britain and America, what do you think we should do? And for somebody who was not a naturally outgoing figure, it was a very difficult experience for him. But in fact, as the war went on, he found himself taking on an active role in terms of making decisions and liaising with people at the very highest levels, and he found himself becoming almost a military leader in and of his own right.
As the war progressed, Princess Elizabeth championed more aspects of wartime life and resilience. George would make Elizabeth an honorary colonel in the Royal Army's 500 Grenadier Guards. Due to the 5-year age gap between the sisters, Margaret was upset as she was not able to join the war effort. She was, however, taught to drive by her sister's newfound knowledge of mechanics, and was noted to have been very proud and supportive of her sister's efforts. When Princess Elizabeth turned 18 in 1944, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, the women's branch of the British Army.
Elizabeth and Margaret largely lived at Windsor Castle because it was felt to be safer than at Buckingham Palace, and obviously they were kept out of harm's way. But Elizabeth was actually a member of the ATS, and it was very interesting both for her on a personal level, but also from a propaganda level, that the king's heir was somebody who was actually doing things. She was being seen as having practical tasks and so on. And it was, I think, very important for the royal family that they were all seen as doing something, doing their bit.
In 1942, the George Cross was awarded to the island and people of Malta in recognition of the heroism with which they had resisted the enemy siege. In 1943, the king met with General Montgomery in North Africa after the success at El Alamein. During this time, Princess Elizabeth was photographed contributing to her allotments at Windsor Castle as part of the government's Dig for Victory campaign, in which people were urged to use gardens and every spare piece of land to grow vegetables to help combat food shortages. The ultimate sign of his trust, however, was the responsibility King George VI granted Elizabeth while he was away on the Italian battlefields. She was named a Councillor of State, which allowed her to represent the UK when her father was abroad and unable to do so.
George had been preparing Elizabeth to one day succeed him as the British monarch and as head of Commonwealth. The way he'd done this is to essentially demonstrate to her what the role of monarch required, and also give her opportunities to begin to develop her own public role. For example, her position in the ATS at the end of the Second World War was a way that she embraced a new public role, demonstrating that she was committed to service and duty. A number of other roles followed. She would accompany her parents on tours during the immediate post-war years, where she went out and was learning, if you like, the ropes of how to be young and royal.
What tragedies, what horrors, what crimes has Hitler and all that Hitler stands for brought upon Europe and the world. It is upon this foundation that Hitler pretends to build out of hatred a new order for Europe. But nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth. Lift up your hearts. All will come right out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice. Will be born again the glory of mankind.
So George VI and Churchill began, when Churchill became Prime Minister, there was a real sense that Churchill was ungovernable. He would not listen to the King. He would tell the King what was going to happen. And George VI also had a distrust for Churchill because he'd been so strongly on his brother's side during the abdication crisis. He was saying, I cannot regard Winston as being my Prime Minister. I regard this as something that I can't get used to. But what happened over the course of World War II was that this relationship sprung up between them, which went from being, I think, mutual animosity to, first of all, a kind of grudging respect, and then later a friendship. And what's very interesting is you can see again in George's life a quasi-paternal relationship arising. I think it gets to its most interesting point. First of all, towards the end, just before D-Day, that both Churchill and the King wanted to be on the troop boats landing in Normandy, and the King realised quite quickly that he couldn't, because obviously had he been killed it would have been catastrophic. But Churchill, up to a couple of days before the landing, was all set to do so, and the King wrote him these letters in which he said, if you were to die, it would not just be a personal loss, as well as the loss of my Prime Minister. And so you can see these quite emotive ways in which the two would write to one another. And after the end of the Second World War, and when Churchill lost his, when the Conservative government was replaced by Attlee and the Labour government, George VI was absolutely horrified by it, and he would essentially say, how can the British people be so ungrateful? And it had to be explained to him that Churchill was not Prime Minister for life, that the electorate were allowed to choose another Prime Minister, but he couldn't ever get his head around it. And so in fact, for the rest of his life, he would treat Attlee as a kind of substitute, and Churchill was one that he still asked for advice and still wanted to be in contact with.
We move forward in Italy, headed for the Gothic Line. Bridges totally destroyed by the Nazis at Livorno in an attempt to slow our advance. Behind the lines, King George pays a visit to 5th Army headquarters and is greeted by General Mark Clark. An impressive display of 5th Army strength for the royal visit. It was on this trip that the King had a narrow escape when German mines exploded only a short distance away from his party.
With the war eventually drawing to a close, King George VI made one final trip in 1944, days after the D-Day landing, when he visited his troops in Normandy.
Fighting started inside the city. What did the Hitlerites count on, betraying their people and dooming them to hunger, privation, and the horrors of a siege? Much became clearer afterwards during the questioning of the commandant of Berlin.
The Allies pushed into Western Germany in February 1945. On April 25th, the Red Army entered Berlin. 5 days later, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and the Soviets captured the German parliament building, the Reichstag.
Sound of British Spitfires came howling across the sky. The first enemy took one look and remembered an urgent appointment.
Victory in Europe was declared for the Allies on May 8, 1945, following Germany's unconditional surrender.
And its people, upon the men and women who are defending their island, kingdom, and their empire,
upon the men of the Royal Air Force, who against tremendous odds have shown not only their valor, but their overwhelming superiority as soldiers with wings, front-line heroes in the Battle of Britain.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
On VE, Victory in Europe Day, May the 8th, 1945, Buckingham Palace was a focal point of the celebrations.
Today, we give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital city, war battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed. Speaking from London, I ask you to join with me in that act of thanksgiving. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome. But at this hour, when the dreadful shadow of war has passed far from our hearths and homes in these islands, we may at last make one pause for thanksgiving and then turn our thoughts to the tasks all over the world which peace in Europe brings with it. First, let us remember those who will not come back. Their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services, the women in all of the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing.
In addition to the celebrations, he knew that there was going to be trouble ahead, because Britain was not a country at the end of World War II that was triumphant, although the war had been won. There was going to be enormous economic and social privation. There had been millions of people had died. It was not going to be a time of ease. And I think that what he understood was that despite being king, he'd come to understand the daily lives of his subjects sufficiently well. And making this speech, he was able to acknowledge there were going to be hard times ahead. And so while you look at the speech now and you think that's not entirely what you'd expect from somebody who's just won the war, you understand it far better when you understand his character and the kind of things that somebody would do in that situation. When VE Day finally happened, George and his family were in the palace, and this great cry went up, "We want the king, we want the king." And I think that although he was overawed by it, and although obviously being a naturally shy and retiring man, it was a lot for him to take on, it was still a recognition that over the course of the Second World War, he had gone from being this figure who had been regarded with a sense of suspicion, a sense of distrust almost by the public who had preferred his brother, to being this lauded figure, along with Churchill, who was there on the balcony with him. That the two men were seen as absolutely indistinguishable in terms of their contribution to the war effort, in terms of their importance for the British national character. And I think he ended the war an exceptionally popular monarch.
The elation at winning the war was echoed around the country as the crowds of rejoicing civilians filled the streets, those around Buckingham Palace chanting for their king.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire rapidly transitioned into the modern Commonwealth of Nations. As part of this transition, the monarchy also takes on a new role. The first key moment of change for King George VI is that he's no longer Emperor of India. When India gets its independence in 1947, becoming two separate countries, India and Pakistan, he becomes respected king of both of those countries. Another key moment of change for King George VI is with the London Declaration of 1949, where he is given the title Head of the Commonwealth. So whereas he was once an emperor, he now has this more diffuse title, this less well-defined title, but nevertheless it's a key symbolic role at the heart of this new thing we call Commonwealth. The British royal family, King George, the Queen, and their two daughters took a trip to South Africa. The Second World War had brought into question the bonds of empire, and it had weakened those bonds as a result of strained economies and difficult political situations. The idea of this royal tour was that it was going to strengthen those links once more between Britain and South Africa, and the royal tour was meant to try and cement that bond.
I think that the greatest legacy of King George VI is actually his daughter. I think that she's always reigned very much as her father's daughter. She's reigned as somebody who has prized constancy, stability, good humour, an ability to connect with people in a way that they've always found reassuring, and also a sense that monarchy has to be something of a continuation. The Queen has never been somebody who has seen the monarchy as an opportunity to showboat, unlike her uncle. She's seen monarchy as a duty, and I think that is very much her father's influence. He was faced with the most horrendous situation that anybody has faced with in the 20th century, and he was a successful king during it. And despite his ill health, despite his stammer, despite his shyness, despite his character, he was able to instill in his children, especially his eldest daughter, a sense that this is how you conduct yourself, this is how the royal family has to behave, and we see his influence every day today.
World War II was fierce and unjust, claiming the lives of upwards of 60 million people. It was here, in the time of distress, that the people would become one with the monarchy, all joined in the celebration of the Axis surrender, yet all mourning for the loved ones who were lost. It was by sheer will that the Windsors would survive the conflict, each member doing their part for the people and remaining dutiful to the nation. A mindset which would be passed down throughout the royal generations.